Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As Taylor mentioned, I'm from Enterprise Knowledge, and Jennifer is from WWF. One thing Taylor forgot to mention is that she was actually on this project with me, so she also is an expert in the room as well, so it's really exciting to have her with us. So here's kind of what we plan on covering today. Of course, we'll do introductions of who we are, and we're going to talk through WWF's KM challenges. So there are definitely unique challenges that come with nonprofits. These, of course, range from limited time and resources, dispersed teams, complex regulatory environments that of course impact how knowledge is shared and leveraged. The idea here is that we're going to discover actionable strategies and frameworks that we developed or that we look towards to mature the maturity at WWF. So there are, of course, again, strategic priorities that were really important from a nonprofit perspective. And then the toolkit for success, so some of the things that we recommended that would really take them to the next level of maturity. Go ahead.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Anna, and I've worked in archives, digital asset management, and to a lesser extent, knowledge management. Half that time has been, for about 20 years, and half that time has been spent at World Wildlife Fund, first as their digital asset manager and their photo editor for WWF US, and then as a brief stint for the International Network. And then I had an opportunity to transition into a knowledge management role at WWF, which meant that I transitioned from the operations, marketing, and communications side of the house to the conservation side of the house. And I have recently moved back to for-profit after a tenure at WWF, serving as the digital asset management specialist for CHG Healthcare. And I have a master's in library and information studies, which has kind of informed the flavor of my career.
Yeah, and I'm Jess DeMay. I am currently a KM consultant at Enterprise Knowledge. My background is in KM, so I have several KMI certifications, as well as a master's degree from Kent State University. So KM has definitely been my passion. At Enterprise Knowledge, I work on different strategies, so kind of coming in at the forefront of a project and really helping understand where the organization is at the time and making recommendations to improve, again, that KM maturity. So that's kind of what we did at WWF, and that's how I met Jennifer and why we're here today.
So just to give some context for this presentation, just a little bit about WWF. So WWF, or World Wildlife Fund, as it's known in the United States, is a global environmental NGO. It has about approximately 100 offices across our global network. And in the beginning, WWF heavily focused on wildlife conservation when it was founded in the 1960s. And over time, the scope has scaled exponentially to address environmental threats. And so now WWF kind of looks at conservation more holistically. So some of the priorities for WWF include climate change, food and water security, and the relationship between people and nature. And I should say that the development of the KM program at WWF, sorry, can you still hear me all right? Sure, give me a minute, everyone. How's that? Great. So the development of the KM program at WWF was kind of conceived as being strategically aligned or in supportive of our operational priorities, our conservation priorities. Our leadership saw a need to implement better practices with knowledge, information, data management in order to meet our very large global priorities. And I think for our executive leadership, some of the big things for KM were essentially improving portfolio management, resource mobilization, and trying to leverage knowledge coming from our adaptive management life cycle, our annual adaptive management life cycle. And although we are a global, or I say we, I still think of myself as a panda, even though I've moved on. But even though we are global, even though EK kind of kept an eye on the happenings of the international network, the scope of this assessment was for the US offices, specifically the US headquarters in Washington, DC.
All right, so to take a look at the way that we engaged and approached this project. So as Jennifer mentioned, I guess some of the pain points and issues that they were struggling with are similar across organizations, but the difference in a nonprofit is the fact that the time saved or the efficiencies meant that we are helping the earth, we're helping the pandas or the elephants or whatever the case is. So this is really a powerful project where we really felt like we were making a difference. So these were some of the top priorities or the things that we were looking to really give the most feedback on, or the things that would have the most impact. So establish systems that captured and transfer knowledge and data efficiently. Something that we have found through our discovery, so top down, bottom up, we would interview different people, have focus groups, really review the documentation that they have, that sort of thing. We learned that information is siloed, and again, I think that that's something that's probably across organizations, but the idea was to have a way to search and find that information as quickly as possible, of course, saving that time. Building KM roles and responsibilities and governance to break those silos was a top priority for us as well. So, of course, being consistent, having the roles identified to know who's supposed to do what, that's something that really wasn't there at the moment. Enable search across conservation and communication efforts. So again, those silos were there, really being able to enable the search for the pandas, as they so sweetly call them, or the associates or the employees, whatever you will, can find that information quickly. Create a content strategy and lifecycle management model that builds trust. So something that we heard is that people don't always trust the information that they find. So even if they are able to track it down, is it trustworthy? Is it something that can be utilized? And again, I think that's something that's consistent. But what this means is if the panda doesn't trust the information, they're not going to utilize the system that it came from, which of course then has redundant or duplicate efforts of managing that system. We're looking to accelerate the integrated programs to identify opportunities to standardize those efforts. So Jennifer briefly touched on the integrated programs, but this is really where it was most impactful, being able to find the at a loss for words, but this is where we thought would be most impactful. And then connect those systems kind of behind the scenes so people can find the content, the records, the data, the people was a really big one as well, being able to help people find the people that they needed as well.
And actually, just going back one bit, it was Jess, let me just jump in. So like Jess talked about the integrated programs. So that's the language that WWF adopted to talk about like the really high level, place-based or whole planet-based initiatives. So like, if you're thinking about our organization, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of separate projects that feed up into climate change, that feed up into saving the Amazon, that talk about food security. So that's why EK was helping us focus on kind of developing a framework that could kind of help build up into that portfolio management that I was talking about and resource mobilization. Where should we be putting our money and people?
Which brings up a good point, and something that I forgot to mention is a hurdle that we had here was that time was tight for those pandas. When time and resources are limited, it's really key to weave those KM efforts into their day-to-day processes so they don't they don't even recognize that they're doing it. It's just a part of their day-to-day. And the idea was to integrate the knowledge sharing practices in routine tasks. So project updates, meeting notes, after action reviews, just making it a part of the day-to-day work made it less obvious that that they were actually doing KM, but they were, which was really impactful.
So before Jess gets into summarizes the different challenges that EK surfaced, just to give some context, so in part some of these challenges reflect the growing scope of WWS portfolio, and I was hearing that in earlier sessions as the rationale to bring in knowledge management. And so what was happening is that we were building an infrastructure organically that essentially wasn't helping with that scale. And so even though there was always an appetite to have lessons learned, share information, or have these kind of informal social networks at the organization, the leadership recognized the need to formalize and codify this information sharing, these relationships, et cetera. And that's when we decided to bring enterprise knowledge in for this assessment to kind of help us sort of uncover how we can kind of manage this organic growth.
So as a part of this project, like I mentioned, we had a discovery phase where we really got to know the people, the end users, those pandas, and we surfaced several challenges. One of them was lack of network communication and collaboration. So the people that work at WWF are so smart. They have great experience and expertise in different teams across the globe, really. So we knew that the main focus of leadership was that they wanted the CAM team to increase that cross-collaboration, so really to be able to best utilize the resources that they had. One thing that I think was a large pain point was the fact that there's duplicate efforts because it's not being talked about. So being able to minimize those was really important. Inability to make data-driven decisions. So WWF grew really quickly, and there was expansive global reach. So there's an opportunity here to establish a centralized, reliable source of truth to be able to empower staff to make those data-driven decisions. There wasn't a lot of content or system governance. So from, it was Jennifer and one other person for a huge organization. So there wasn't a lot of oversight of the content that was being created because two people can't do that for such a large organization. So there's definitely an opportunity there to enhance the content consistency, just the management of the repositories and a structured governance. Because of some of the systems not really being reliable, there was an over-reliance on experts. So there were a lot of informal networks that were created. And of course, as KMers, we really love the idea of a community of practice. But when those experts are called upon over and over and over again, they're really taxed. So the idea here was to be able to have a place for people to search, find the information themselves. And then if they don't find that, then they go to the experts. So just, of course, reducing the time to make sure that those experts aren't spending so much time just answering questions. There was a lack of strategic KM alignment. So the idea here was to have strong KM advocates being able to clearly define the KM team roles, embed KM within the programmatic work, like I mentioned earlier, make it a part of their daily processes, because at the time when we first came on, that really wasn't visible. Change fatigue was another one where there have been CAM initiatives in the past or different types of change management initiatives, and the pandas were just tired. I think—
And angry.
And angry. Yeah, so we kind of knew that things were stacked against us right when we joined because they had already gone through this before. So what were ways that we could show the value and the worth, that this is worth your time, there are things that are going to benefit you in the long run. And a limited ability to find and discover information. Like I mentioned, lots of silos, lots of different places to go. People didn't know which system to go to find what information. Again, not a challenge that isn't seen by many, but this was definitely a challenge that we were looking to address. So with that, we had defined the priorities that we, of course, talked about with the KM team, or the main people that we were talking to, of course being Jennifer, but then also leadership as well to get sign off on what the priorities should be. So define the right repositories to store information managed by WWUS. So having a suitable, standardized way to store the information was really important and definitely a priority. Making programmatic data available for that decision making. Today, again, it was in silos across the organization. There wasn't a clear way of connecting this data to this data, so ways to make it more seamless for the user to be able to find it and actually make decisions using it. Break information silos by connecting, organizing, and maintaining content. So again, we mentioned it was kind of a free-for-all, no offense to WWF, but there was a lot of information coming in, but it wasn't necessarily structured in a way that can be reused. Of course, define KM roles and responsibilities to support that cross-team collaboration. So approaching it from a way of like, this is just a part of your day-to-day job. What are ways that we can all work collectively to make KM better? And then create a portal to search across conservation resources. So one thing I really want to emphasize here is that the technology was enabling. The idea here was that we wanted it to support the work that we were doing, but it really wasn't the main work that we were doing. The creating of the processes, the understanding of people's needs and what they wanted, the culture of encouraging a knowledge-sharing culture in a way that wasn't taxing on a small group of people like experts were some of the priorities.
And actually, just if you don't mind, we could go back a slide. So I should have given some additional context in terms of the team that Jess is referencing. So like many things at WWF, like a kind of organic team kind of came together like out of need, which was essentially folks from our IT business processes, our program operations folks, who are the people that are managing all the money coming in and out against like our priority work. Our CIO, of course, our CCO had interest, and then myself as the KM lead. So like we were kind of working with EK to kind of identify the challenges and the essential priorities moving forward. So it was a small team of us that were kind of working cross-functionally to think about some of the solutions for some of these problems.
Great, Ed, thank you. So this is kind of the ROI, what does this mean for WWF? And there's a lot of little text on here, so I'll try to explain what our thoughts were. But ultimately, we recognize that the strategic efficiency gains in those administrative processes and information access are going to enhance WWF's ability to allocate resources towards those conservation efforts. So saving the rainforests and the pandas and all the good things that come from the work that they do. So EK's internal research reveals that employees may spend up to 40% of their time searching for information or recreating it. It's a huge waste of time if you can't access or you have to recreate. So, of course, reducing that time reduces the drain, and it frees up capacity for that mission-critical work. So the goal of this KM initiative was to decrease time those employees or pandas spend searching for information by 1% in the first year and 2% in the second. And that seems small, but the numbers are actually pretty drastic. So in year one, that would save about 37,000 hours, translates into, of course, really significant cost savings. To share that in dollars, it's actually over $4 million based off of the work that WWF does. And we pulled that from their financial reports just based off of the data that we had. And that, of course, year two would double the impact. So really significant savings that could go to really great work. So the idea here would We'd be able to reduce the administration expenses that would support greater number of donors, additional program funds, faster response times for the conservation teams, accelerating fundraising and those outreach efforts. So again, really impactful for any sort of nonprofit organization.
Are you taking questions as you go or at the end?
Oh, I think we're going to wait till the end.
That's okay. We can come back to this though. All right, so these are some of the high-level solutions that illustrate the way that implementing governance, search, and findability, the content strategy, and the knowledge portal can really drive efficiency. So these are some of the recommendations that we made. So first, for search and findability, to just develop a search strategy that provides quick access to the content and to the experts, and improve efficiency and reduce time to find information.
Yeah, and just quickly, is there anybody here who has or does work in conservation? All right. I was going to say, like with the search and findability, when you work in conservation, the nomenclature is always shifting in the way that scientists, conservationists describe priority work. And so what that meant for WWF was that the nomenclature that we were using was not being updated consistently across our systems or even within our systems. And so, for example, if you would go to like our intranet and you were looking for climate resilience, like you would potentially get outdated information because potentially that was no longer the nomenclature for it. So there was a number of people accessing different types of information depending on what their search was, which was potentially outdated, incorrect, or just didn't reflect the current nomenclature that we were using to sort of speak internally, but also externally, because WWF does huge amounts of marketing and communication advocacy. So like to have that kind of consistent speak was really important.
Absolutely. And then from a KM governance perspective, just having a framework that provides transparency and clarity, who's responsible for what, making sure that the information is kept up to date, it's not duplicative, it doesn't have, it's not outdated, accountability. So again, when you're assigning roles and responsibilities to the people, then they, of course, know that they're responsible for this little piece of the pie. So then they don't feel overburdened because it's just a smaller group of things, like it doesn't all fall on their shoulders. And then trust. So when you implement a governance structure, the people tend to understand that there's these structures in place, and they tend to trust the information a little bit more than they did maybe without it.
Yeah, and so like when Jess and I were talking about this presentation, like I had to confess that the governance, as someone who had come from like a digital asset management background, was sort of hard to visualize at first. And so I kind of started to think about it like waves kind of smoothing over the sand, right? Like kind of smoothing the organization in terms of its framework. And you know, essentially you had to know who to know to get the right information. So like if you didn't have a strong social network at WWF, like oftentimes you would not know who to ask for the information, which meant that you were either going to the website or the internet with a poor search to kind of find out that information. And in addition, the organization had done, because things with the pandemic, had done a big hire, like there was a lot of new pandas, and so not having those developed social networks really put them at a disadvantage. And so having that governance model across the conservation division in particular, so that people know who the experts are, who holds the information, essentially who's doing what, will be really transformational for WWF. I think in terms of the efficiency that Jess just talked about earlier, but also just like frustration and alignment, I think would be, huge gains there.
Yeah, so the next one was a knowledge portal, and something that may get me in trouble is the fact that there's not one technology that does this. From EK's perspective, we're bringing in all the tools into one UI, but in the background, there's probably a web of technologies behind the scenes. So in this organization, there was a bunch of different tools that we needed to tie together. So the end user didn't necessarily recognize or know that they were accessing information from a variety of tools. They only had to go to one place, find the information. If it was necessary, it would link to that tool. But ultimately, it was maintained in the area it was housed in. But from an end user perspective, it was easy to find the information. So this was centralized access, simplified knowledge transfer. So pulling it in from the experts, putting it in a place that it can be found and reused was really important. This reduced change fatigue. There weren't a bunch of tools coming in. If we needed to add a tool, it would be added in the background behind the scenes. The end user wouldn't necessarily know that it was there or changed, and just offered better collaboration across teams.
Yeah, just to reiterate, so like, again, coming from a digital asset management background, like this was a really interesting concept. And so just alluded, WWF essentially was like buying more and more technology as like a Band-Aid over what was essentially governance process search issues. And so our people were having a harder time understanding like which systems were out there and what was the vetted information. So this idea of having a portal that takes these like disparate sources of information and kind of like maps them into one dashboard for our people to access, I thought was really revelatory. And what EK had suggested in an iterative process, which we'll get into in a bit, which this is part of, was that we would start with some of the vetted sources of information and data that we knew were reliable, we knew that our people needed. And so it could look like for us, it could be qualitative information like strategy narratives and vision statements for development and donor relationship folks. It could be the quantitative data from our priority landscape database, which essentially would have been used from everyone from the web team to even our conservation folks. It could be that subject matter expert directory so that people know who's who and who knows what and who to ask. And I really saw this recommendation as being something that could be so transformative for WWF. It could be used in onboarding all the way to portfolio management with our executive leadership. I really saw this as an equalizer in terms of like how information was sort of democratized. I don't know if that's a word, but you hear me, throughout the organization. So I thought it could be a very powerful tool for us.
And last but not least was the content strategy. So this was just reducing duplicate work, streamlining the way that information was published, and improved user trust, which I mentioned earlier. People weren't necessarily trustworthy of the content, so having that strategy in place was really important.
Yeah, and while we were working with EK, like what was happening in parallel was the emergence of a project management support team, which was also one of our like organizational priorities. And so they had done a great job of developing a community of practice, and from that community of practice was the need and desire to have access to past project proposals that would help project managers, program managers, like look at past efforts or past successes and lessons learned to kind of inform what they were working on now or what they wanted to work in the future. So like that essentially they wanted to kind of build into a lessons learned database, but like just having those proposals in a centralized place or like having some governance on that and understanding where they actually were would have been huge for the program managers at WWF.
All right.
So in terms of the strategic pathways, like I think, again, starting as a digital asset manager at WWF, I think I underestimated how much of a long game a knowledge management program was going to be at WWF. And, EK kind of helped us sort of break it apart into different phases, an iterative process that would kind of build upon the other, like the processes or the phases would kind of build upon each other to kind of help build out this program. And because we were like, I think our title is like from the ground up, and it really was from the ground up. There was no the understanding of what knowledge management is or how it could help an NGO like WWF. There was, a kind of, which is not unique to WWF, but like an understanding that like our assumption that your technology will fix your process, governance, and search problems. So there was a lot of, socialization, education, change management, not to mention the governance and the search and the kind of real knowledge management sort of tactile parts.
Yeah, so the idea here is not to boil the ocean, right? So with the KM strategic pathways of root, grow, and bloom, it essentially organized high-level solutions into phases that prioritize implementation based on feasibility and complexity. So it was basically to guide WWF in transforming those KM strategic enabler for the conservation impact and to build upon one another for that lasting impact. So in the first phase, we're looking to establish strong KM roots that withstand the inherent shifts in those conservation priorities. So thinking back to kind of those solutions we just talked about earlier, it's the a first implementable version of a taxonomy to organize some of the nomenclature, right? It's bringing out the first version of a knowledge portal, taking user feedback into consideration and building upon what is needed versus what is there. It's basically the first layer of their full KM strategy. In the second phase, we're looking to integrate KM practices into the conservation operation workflows that really demonstrate the value. So of course we want to have quick wins along the way, but here we're really building out that foundation. We're looking to expand the FIV taxonomy maybe into different groups or pull in skills from the people or the experts that are there. We're looking to procure maybe a taxonomy management system that can that can span across different repositories. And the knowledge portal then will integrate maybe into an HR system, so we can not only pull in the skills that they have, but make sure that it's automatically updating based off of the employee profiles. And then that third phase, we're looking to leverage advanced KM technologies to amplify the conservation outcomes through that knowledge sharing. So we're looking at the implementation of the full knowledge portal. We've taken users into consideration. We have the governance structure built out. The content is being maintained properly. It's being audited. It's being reviewed. So people now have a really strong trust in the system that they're looking at. And they're able to find the data that they need very quickly and easily. So with that, organizations can select from a variety of operating models. Being cognizant of time, you can access this deck online. You can see that there are a variety of them running from centralized, where all KM activities are managed through an enterprise-wide team or department, decentralized, where kind of each team kind of does their own thing. Of course, some of the cons there would be silos, so that wasn't the best approach for WWF. What we ended up recommending for WWF was an enablement model that balanced the organizational structure with the flexibility needed to support diverse initiatives, right? So having a cross-functional community group that works together to really build out the roles, responsibilities across the organization.
And so just really quick, so like in terms of the enablement model, we agreed that that was a good fit because one, this was not going to be a KM program that was dictative. It just wasn't aligned with the culture of the organization. We also knew that there was holistic, or I shouldn't say holistic, organic efforts that we could leverage to kind of help fold in as champions and part of the community of practice for this. And we also, as I said, we had this project management support team that was embarking on something very similar, and it was succeeding for them. So this made sense. This seemed like a good fit for us.
Yeah, and you'll see that on the diagram on the right, that it kind of covered the conservation and operation groups, so it was cross-functional. So the kind of the center of excellence there was to guide strategic KM direction, support team development, and secure leadership buy-in. The KM enablement team really was the core team, right? They were the ones that were kind of doing the footwork, making things happen, making those decisions that aligned with the conservation strategy. And then we broke down search, taxonomy, content, and KM technology into different work streams. So you would have a lead for search, a lead for taxonomy, ideally a taxonomist, if you can make that happen, a content lead, and then the technology lead. So these would be those middle people between the business users and the actual tech that goes into it, or the development of the search or the taxonomy, whatever the case may be. And then, of course, KM champions. This is really important in any organization. You need to find the people that understand the language you're speaking and make them be a part, or not make them, encourage them to be a part of your process, right? They think in a way that is going to be that's going to get the buy-in, right? If people see their peers speaking about something and approving it or supporting it, they're more likely then to, of course, adopt it as well. I'm just going to briefly go over this one. So just talking through who would kind of be responsible. So from the KM Center of Excellence, we're thinking it's essentially an executive committee. We want them to be informed of the work that is happening. We want them to build the relationships with leadership, but they're not necessarily involved in day-to-day tasks that are going to happen. That's kind of where the KM core team comes into play, where we have that Center of Excellence lead. So there's probably someone within the Center of Excellence, one person that would come into the core team and kind of be that middle person between the core team and the leaders. Of course, the enablement team is thinking, the KM team themselves, and then the work stream leads. So from that taxonomy, content, search, and technology. So they're essentially responsible for leading that community group. And then KM champions are going to work across the organization. They're really crucial because they're kind of the advocate for their department. If we only build to one department, it's not going to work cross-functionally. So we really need to bring in different voices into the room to understand what their users are asking. So the value of knowledge management, enablement in government. This, of course, defines KPIs to monitor progress towards the goals that we're looking to develop. It establishes feedback mechanisms to influence future initiatives and planning. So this is really important in, again, taking those users into consideration. If they see that their feedback is being incorporated, they're, again, more likely to buy in. It anticipates potential roadblocks and other challenges. Of course, we're more likely to be able to cover those roadblocks and address them before they happen if we know that they're coming. It also recommends approaches to maintain and enhance the processes, the tools that we've been talking about this whole time. And then, of course, it facilitates that cross-functional collaboration that really was the leading factor of this project.
So, as I noted, socializing and educating KM was kind of one of the main things that we had to focus on doing. And because there were so many essentially fires to be put out, the KM team had a kind of a hard time understanding like who they were, who we were. And so what EK helped us do is kind of create a mission statement for ourselves in order to kind of like define what the KM shop was going to look like for WWF, but also use that as like a internal promotional materials to start kind of educating our different people about who we were and what kind of value we could serve.
So here are some of the dimensions of enablement that were really important to consider as we went through the project. So as we mentioned, defining those roles and responsibilities, really putting a face and name to the different things that needed to happen. Policies, procedures, and workflows, these are something that really weren't existing at the time. So having the procedures documented in a place that can be accessed, having workflows so that when content was created, it was reviewed, it was approved. And not only that, but then when it was outdated, should it be archived, should it be removed, that sort of thing. Templates and toolkits, the content of the enablement team was ultimately going to create these best practices or these guidelines that they can be reused across the organization. And so if I'm searching in one location, the template or the layout is the same across so that it is coherent to me, I understand it, that sort of thing. Communications and marketing were really important. Again, we heard about that that change fatigue. So making sure it was communicated broadly, though with them, making sure people understand why it's important, why they're doing it, and marketing the new kind of layout of the KM enablement team was really important. And then the tools and the tech were, of course, as I mentioned, not the most important thing, but they were there. They needed to be used, and it was really important to have the technology to support their efforts, and the infrastructure is in place. So the ways that we recommended WWF kind of roll this out was to have, the first step is to define those success criteria, right? So what is it that we're trying to accomplish? What are those goals? Ideally, finding ways that we can measure the success. It's really important to have those quick wins so leadership can understand, hopefully buy in sooner rather than later. The enablement team needed to gather and present that data for each success indicator. This was essentially a baseline that would allow them to track the progress as they go. And then, of course, facilitate conversations around what is working, what isn't, and transition into a place where, again, the users' feedback is brought in. They're measuring the way that the tools, the processes are being used, and ensuring that they can kind of adjust based off of the needs. And then, of course, like I said, having that continuous feedback loop is really important to be able to understand what is working.
So I think we're running out of time, so I'm just going to surmise is that I came into this assessment and this work like having a partial understanding of how KM could be advantageous for WWF, and at the end of this assessment, I truly believe that it could be transformational for WWF, from everything from new employees, I said, to executive portfolio management. Essentially, this was going to help WWF to tell us if our work was in fact working, and so I'm very grateful to the Enterprise Knowledge team for helping us kind of come to this assessment and think about what KM could look like for WWF.
So we didn't save a ton of time, but we'd love to answer any questions you may have as we went through that.
Hi, thank you very much. This is very, very interesting. So I have several questions, but I'll just mention a few and answer what you can. So as far as the steps that you took to develop this program, I was wondering which did you see as being a rate limiting step? So like what took the longest amount of time? And what do you see as maybe the one or two key steps that you want to make sure, every program wants to make sure that you do this, okay? And then I'm very interested in this knowledge portal. And I'm wondering if it's built on business intelligence, for example, Power BI. Is Power BI running it? And you mentioned that there are duplicative information, like in different areas of the website and things like this. Are they now pointing to a single object where you just make the updates or changes one time and then that change is propagated throughout the system wherever that reference is?
You want me to take the steps?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
That'd be great.
So again, as I said, I can't emphasize enough what a long game this is going to take at WWF. And like one of the challenges was really the change fatigue that WWF was experiencing, and because of that, there was a lot of resistance to this. And so I think we acknowledge it had to be an iterative process, and we would have to kind of think about low-hanging fruit. And so what that meant would be working with the champions, which were our IT business solutions, our program operations people, the people that had to manage the money coming in and out against like the grants. There were some folks within the conservation division that we're going to use as a case study on the adaptive management knowledge gathering kind of piece of this. So there'd be like a governance piece to that. And then our CIO, like Jess mentioned, like I think seasoned professionals like EK were amazed by the amount of technology we had. Like every time they'd be like, are we done? And we just bring them like a new digital wheelbarrow of applications. And so she was very keen to kind of clean up the house. And I think we were hoping to kind of start building in that iterative framework that would sort of start bleeding into the conservation side of the house, which essentially required the greatest cleanup.
From the knowledge portal perspective, there are a variety of ways that those could be developed. Ultimately, though, it's literally just a UI that could be created in-house. Enterprise Knowledge does this kind of like with our architects. But the idea is having a knowledge graph behind the scenes that are connecting all of the resources and repositories. So not necessarily having a KMS solution, but a way to connect the dots between all of the tools. A part of that content management strategy would be to develop a way to kind of consolidate or have reusable knowledge. So if it should be on the website, but also internally, having a way like the compartmentalized versions that can be used here and then also there. So we're updating it in one place, but it can go out to a variety of places, yeah. Yes, of course.
Let's make time for, okay, we got like, we'll go over there. Passion.
Hey, thank you so much for sharing your experience and knowledge. Also work in the nonprofit space, and I think one challenge that we have is specifically around buy-in for governance on the programmatic side. And so I was hoping you could share techniques, tips, even pitfalls, right, of how you went about implementing governance processes at WWF. Hoping that there's something we can learn from and not suffer through.
Do you want to talk, I mean, so what I would say is like this was just the assessment, so we were really on the precipice. And so like going back to your question, we were going to start with low-hanging fruit, which was essentially the non-conservation folks with essential, like there was like 2 teams that were like going to buy in that we can kind of sold them on it. We have like, I think 5 or 6 major teams, and they're almost like they're separate companies within the organization. And so that said, I kind of was thinking that, like, I imagine that within those siloed teams, there is essentially some governance that we could have leveraged and sort of made it more cross-functional. But in terms of, like, best practices, Jess is the lady you want to talk to.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, where you want to start small to show the value that comes from governance. Working in another organization now, and the approach is similar in that bunch of different kind of, it's one organization, but it has a bunch of different like smaller groups that kind of do their own thing. So it's important to get the buy-in to show, like, again, the what's in it for me. So it is a little bit different depending on the organization, like what is showing the greatest success. And again, finding the time to make sure that people are actually doing these things. So that's kind of why we approached it from this enablement aspect, where all of the governance piece of the content management did not fall on one person. And that was really important, where we're not asking you to wear another hat on top of the 17 other hats you already wear. It's if we work together collaboratively to make sure that this information is maintained, to have the roles and responsibilities defined, then it takes the burden off of just one person doing it, which in my experience has had the greatest success of getting people to actually do it.
Cool. It's like sneaking in the veggies in the spaghetti sauce.
Exactly. Great analogy.
Do you want to ask your ROI question?
Yeah.
So you had a slide up there about a 1% improvement in search. Is that something you're able to measure, or is that just sort of a what if?
Yeah, so the idea here was there's a couple of different ways that you can determine what the savings are in terms of time. So we've surveyed people, like how much time do you take finding information. It could be through the technology of how many times are you searching for something. There are metrics that can be monitored depending on the tool that's available. So
Let me add though, like, they're essentially, with the exception of maybe the digital asset management and like the grant management systems, like there was no search management. So like anything was going to be something, you know, so.
Yeah.
When you were talking about governance, were you using any external industry framework like ISO or any other kind of best practice as a guide?
Yeah, we tend to use ISO as a guide. It definitely depends on the organization and what their requirements are, especially from like how long you retain the document, that sort of thing. So that depends on the organization. So from an EK perspective, we research to determine what are the requirements for that specific organization. I don't know if we did that for WWF or not, though.
Oh, gosh, that I do not know. I'm sorry. I can check, though, and follow up.
All right, well, we want to get you all to your coffee break in time in the showcase. Let's give a round of applause to our presenters.
Thank you.
I'll make them stay up here a few minutes if you have any extra questions.